Hey guys, hope you're all doing real well. Back with another polars tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about how to compare two data frames in polars using the Datacompy library in Python. So today we're getting maybe a little bit away from the programming aspect of data science and towards more the review or subject matter side of data science. So oftentimes when you're working on a project in an organization, the organization for which you're working is going to want to make sure that you're taking steps to make sure that output is validated and is good for release or good for releasing to the customer or whoever the main stakeholder may be. And oftentimes what they'll do, one of the main methods they'll use is they'll have two programmers dual program the specification that they provide. And so then after that, after the programmers go through the specification, they'll compare their outputs. And if the two outputs match, then that gives them some assurance that the instructions are followed. So we'll go over how to compare data frames and how to produce a nice clean report to give you some assurance that your output matches. So again, what I'm going to be using today, there's a couple different libraries you can use. I might make a separate video on some of the other polars comparison libraries available in some subsequent videos. But today I'll be using the Datacompy library, and it's very, very easy to use and implement. So basically the first step you'll need to do is you'll need to make sure you have the dependency or the library. And to do that, you'll do a simple pip install and then Datacompy, or conda install if you're using Anaconda, Datacompy. And then you're going to import it into your program. And the module you're going to want to bring in is polars compare. And so what that's going to look like is this just from datacompy.polars import polars compare. And then you'll be ready to use it. And so what we're going to be comparing is just these two little small made-up data frames that we have here, just some data that I inputted myself. At the moment, these are just mirror images of each other, so these should compare favorably the first time we try to implement this. Just get rid of that right there. And so to compare the data frames, there's a number of arguments you can use. There's quite a few quality of life arguments that I leave out right here. I'll let you research those on your own. The goal of this video is just to provide a brief introduction. So there's three main arguments that you're going to want to use. There's a df1 argument and a df2 argument, and that's basically where you specify the data frames you're using. And so the data frames I'm comparing is this is data frame I created called first, and then a second one called second. Very imaginative, right? And so those two arguments are the df1 and df2 arguments. And then there's a join columns argument, and that's where you specify the ID variable where it's going to identify records to compare. And so what this means is that it's going to join on this ID variable, and record 1 is going to be compared to record 1. Record 2 is going to be compared to the other record that has that ID variable of 2, and so on and so forth. Now, if you're comparing pandas, if you're using this to compare pandas data frames, I think this join columns argument might be optional, and then it'll just compare on the index. But in polars, there is no index, so this is basically, for all intents and purposes, required if you're using a polars data frame, which is a good thing. I always like to be more explicit. And then really the last thing you have to do is you have to generate a summary of the differences with the report method. And so what we're going to do is we're going to print, and so when we run this code, it's going to create this object called compare, and then we can just run the report method on that compare compare object, and then print that to the screen. So we'll just go ahead and run this code and see what that looks like. Sorry about that, I got a phone call. Okay, so let's just go over the comparison here. So the first thing that shows up is this Datacompy comparison. So this is the beginning of the report. And then we have a data frame summary, and it starts off by giving us a summary of the rows and columns. This is the number of columns and the number of rows in both data frames. And we see df1 and df2, and that corresponds to the two options specified there. And then we have a column summary, and that's the number of columns in common, and then a summary of the mismatched columns. Then a summary of the matched IDs, the number of rows in common, and then a summary of the mismatched rows. And so then we have here number of columns compared with some unequal values, and then number of columns compared with all equal values. So 3 all equal, and then 3 all equal rows. And so that means everything's matching. And so let's just go ahead and change our data here so we can get some differences, so we can see what it looks like when we have mismatched values. And as we can see, it's going to look very similar as before, but our report is just going to change slightly. Okay, so now our report shows that there's 1 row with unequal values, and there's 2 columns with unequal values. And so let's look at what those are. So now we have a summary of the 2 unequal columns, age and sex. Each have one unequal value, and we have a max difference of 6. And there's no max difference for sex because that's a string column. And then this is really valuable right here. It gives us the ID. We get a sample of the rows with unequal values, and it gives us the ID as well as the values in both mismatching data frames. And so then we see here that the problem record is record 2, and so we can go up here to record 2 and just kind of get an idea as to why we're getting these mismatched values. So that's all there is to comparing data frames with the Datacompy library, guys. It's very easy to use and implement. In the future, I might make some videos on other comparison libraries. So thanks so much for watching, and have a good evening.